Well, I've got the distinct pleasure of introducing our next keynote speaker and panel, Richard Barrett, who is at the United Nations. He oversees and is the coordinator of the formal title is the Analytical Support and Sanctions Implementation Monitoring Team, better known as the Al-Qaeda and Taliban Monitoring Team. But Richard comes to the United Nations from a very distinguished career inside UK government, both at the security service, so he can have an appreciation for the domestic challenges, ones that we all too are grappling with in terms of what is domestic intelligence and how do we go about addressing some of these issues, but also as a former SIS officer, aka MI6. And folks that I respect very much inside our own community keep singing Richard's praises. I've had the benefit of hosting Richard here before on an Al-Qaeda discussion, and I genuinely mean when I say he's probably the most informed looking at Al-Qaeda from an analytical perspective, literally in the world today. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that Richard is at the United Nations, along with another good friend, Mike Smith. So if we can't work it out with the Brits and the Australians, then we've got trouble, and they're two of the most talented public servants we'll ever see. But Richard is here. He has also been given the lead to chair a panel looking at terrorist use of the internet. And they recently came out with a report, and they're continuing to follow up on the implementation of some of their findings. And when we talk about cyber, it's futile to look at it through a national lens alone. Perhaps this issue, more than any other, is inherently transnational, and perhaps more than any other will require some transnational solutions, and I couldn't think of a better person than Richard to trigger the discussion here. And then we've got, and then I'll introduce David and Neill right after Richard's comments. Richard, if it's okay, we'll have you give your keynote and then save the Q&A for a panel discussion, if that works for you. Without further ado, a dear friend and a distinguished colleague, Richard Barrett. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Frank, for that magnificent build-up. It's true, I think, that when we look at the threat from anything to do with internet, whatever form of threat it is, we have to take the international perspective into account. And rather than talking very broadly about all the various forms of cyber threat that exist out there, I want to focus particularly on the terrorist threat and the sort of rather narrow perspective of terrorist use of the internet. But I think that's a reasonable thing to do, I hope you'll agree, because the use of the internet has been a significant force multiplier for terrorist groups, even for those, I think, that do not have any particular global agenda. And although terrorism is not the greatest cyber threat that to the security of the United States, nor I think the greatest security threat to any nation in the world, it's nonetheless a threat that creates considerable concern, not just here, but across the international community. And I think given this international concern, it may be easier to develop policy and find solutions to the many different categories of difficulty presented by abuse of the internet, whether they're political or legal or technical, financial or even social. All these areas, I think, are involved in any move to restrict the use of the internet in the context of terrorism. But nonetheless, in the context of terrorism, there are no strategic losers when you come to talking about restricting their use beyond the terrorists themselves, whereas, of course, in other contexts, an advantage to one state might be seen very much as a disadvantage to another. And indeed, I think that most of you, because you're experts in this field, would agree that some countries may have overemphasized the threat proposed by terrorists' use of the internet as a way to promote a debate about issues of deterrence that are far more important to them in other and more conventional areas of international relations. And so far as I know, terrorists have not yet used the internet to mount any significant attack, such as a major denial of service or the sabotage of critical infrastructure. They have, of course, used it extensively for other purposes, and many of the current generation of terrorist supporters and sympathizers display an almost nerdish familiarity with the internet and the opportunities it provides, whether for spreading propaganda or communicating with one another securely, or for hacking into websites or stealing money. And Al-Qaeda, indeed, even has its own brigade of activists that boasts of operating solely in cyberspace. And Al-Qaeda leaders have often commented on the value of such technically adept supporters. There are, of course, numerous attempts every day to hack into government websites or infrastructure control systems. And some of these may be the work of terrorists. I don't discount that. And the lack of success surely doesn't necessarily mean an absence of effort. But one important element of most definitions of terrorism is that it should be an act designed to cause loss of life or serious physical injury in an indiscriminate manner. And in this respect, it has so far been an offline activity rather than an online activity. But there are, as I said, plenty of other reasons to consider what could be done to limit the use of the internet as a way to promote or plan terrorist acts. The use of the internet to spread news of terrorism around the world and other terrorist propaganda has already had the effect of magnifying the impact of terrorism as a means to intimidate the public, as well as a way to spread its appeal. And the internet has also allowed terrorists to train and to communicate plans and techniques. And in September of 2006, the United Nations adopted a global strategy to counter-terrorism, which, very unusually for the United Nations, was supported by all 192 of its members, which included a pledge to coordinate efforts at the international and regional level to counter terrorism in all its forms and manifestations on the internet. And as a result, the United Nations Task Force, which was established by the Secretary General to implement the strategy, set up a working group to counter the use of the internet for terrorist purposes. And this working group, as Frank mentioned, produced its first report earlier this year, and we hope to produce another one around February or March next year. And if I may, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our approach and the work that we've done. Essentially, there are five separate categories of issues in my view around the general problem of dealing with terrorist use of the internet. The political issues, the legal issues, the technical issues, the financial issues, and the civil society or social issues. And the political issues arise at both a national and an international level. I mean, some countries, like the United States, for example, have very strong protections of freedom of speech. And any move to limit that freedom excites a fierce debate. Whereas other countries, of course, have much less concern about those particular freedoms, as they see them being abused to their disadvantage, for example, by terrorist groups operating through websites that are beyond their jurisdiction, but are tolerated in the countries in which they're based. On the legal side, leaving aside whatever domestic difficulties exist to criminalize terrorist use of the internet, these are magnified several-fold when it comes to negotiating international agreements. Different cultures and different legal systems make it extremely hard even to find a starting point for these discussions. And the lack of an agreed definition of what is meant by terrorism further complicates the issue. And technically, the possibility of restricting terrorist use of the internet also seems extremely difficult, even for those countries like the United States that have the capacity to try. The amount of other crime perpetrated through the internet, particularly fraud and other financial crime, and the Senator was saying earlier about the $8 billion stolen through internet crime annually in the United States. These levels have reached a stage that new ideas have begun to emerge to deal with them, with this sort of crime, but the ideas that have emerged, I think, have generally focused on making systems more secure and in detecting maldoers, criminals, than on interrupting the flow of internet traffic. And I do note that on the last 2 anniversaries of 9/11, we saw an impressive ability by security agencies in some countries to shut down, at least temporarily, existing terrorist websites. But that action hasn't prevented them from reopening from alternative bases. And I think that the difficulty of keeping sites closed is apparent to everybody who tries to do so. And while countries like China may have attempted to funnel all incoming internet traffic through particular choke points that allow the exercise of some censorship, I understand that this is incredibly resource-intensive work and is not without commercial consequences and is not anyway entirely successful. And I think is unlikely to get any easier as the growth of internet traffic continues. The financial cost more broadly of taking such action as the Chinese do in any country is also significant. I mean, I can imagine in China that the government would bear the cost, but in almost every other area of the world, the authorities would likely demand that internet service providers and others in the industry carry at least some of the burden. And to recoup the costs would require a radical change in the way that the internet services are provided to the general public. And this in turn, I think, would lead to social consequences, to widespread public protest, and indeed to a loss of one of the great contributions of the internet as a way to spread ideas and to establish global standards of behavior. I think most people would agree that an open internet that is easily and cheaply accessible has more of a positive than a negative impact on the world, and is an effective way to preserve and promote the fundamental values that underpin the International Declaration of Human Rights. Anyway, these were the basic assumptions of our working group, and we sent a questionnaire to all members of the United Nations and asking them to tell us what laws, programs, or resources they had devoted to countering terrorist use of the internet. And we also asked the industry, academia, and civil society groups for their views too. Most countries saw cybersecurity as an important issue, though not just from fear of terrorist attacks. Indoctrination, recruitment, training, fundraising, communication, data mining, and propaganda were also very commonly expressed concerns. And the range of problems identified by the respondents to our questionnaire suggests there can be no one integrated approach to dealing with terrorist use of the internet. Similarly, the range of legal responses by states to the threat of cyberterrorism showed a wide variety, especially when it came to defining the nature of the crime itself. In almost all cases, countries recognized the need for close international collaboration and for a partnership with the private sector. And the private sector has so far played, I think, the dominant role in providing cybersecurity in the form of malware solutions or patches to reduce vulnerability to attack in certain software. But as cyber attacks have become more politicized, even if not terrorist, and as government has moved increasingly online, the issue of cybersecurity has become a matter of national interest as well, even where the private sector may be responsible for much of the national critical infrastructure. And this has led to arguments for greater governmental supervision of industry self-governance on security issues. All respondents to our questionnaire and others consulted by the working group agreed that the most pressing need in order to address all forms of cybercrime was the development of sensible, interoperable cybercrime laws. The Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime was one of the most widely quoted examples of useful international legislation, though that convention also reflects some basic problems caused by different definitions and standards. For example, in the negotiation of the Council of Europe Convention on Cybercrime, in which the United States also took part, the only crime that everybody could agree on was to do with child pornography. And so all other criminal uses or potentially criminal uses of the internet were put into an additional protocol which countries could or could not sign according to their own domestic approach. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization has also recently concluded an agreement on cyberterrorism, and I think it reflects very closely the position of the Russian Federation. I think the other members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization were prepared to go along with it, but it is essentially a Russian document. So interesting from that point of view, because of course Russia is the state most concerned about having some sort of control of the use of the internet in an aggressive manner. And most concerned because, of course, they believe that most of the software being used, not just in other countries but also in Russia itself, is manufactured in the United States. So as well as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, there's been work by the African Union, by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the European Union, the Organization of American States, and the Gulf Cooperation Council. And all this work, I think, has begun to identify a basis on which some sort of international convention or some sort of negotiation towards an international negotiation could be built, though huge difficulties remain, as well, of course, as all those problems of implementation and enforcement which necessarily follow international agreements. But along with the development of laws to control the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, of course there are also some sort of international response mechanisms, such as the International Multilateral Partnership Against Cyber Threats, known as IMPACT in Malaysia, and of course the NATO Cyber Defense Center of Excellence in Estonia. But our working group found that although there was a beginning of international effort to deal with the consequences of cyber attacks, the capacity of the global internet to recover from any serious disruption depends still much more on informal links between a small group of key individuals than on any structure that so far exists. Respondents to our questionnaire quoted both legal and illegal uses of the internet by terrorists preparing for an attack. For example, maybe by downloading images of the target or by raising money through credit card fraud. And the use of the internet in these cases would seem incidental to the terrorist act. Just because a terrorist finds something useful, it can't mean that access to it should be banned for everyone. And similarly, if a terrorist resorts to crime to fund his terrorist activities, doesn't necessarily make that crime a terrorist act itself. Another issue was the dissemination of information, which was widely seen as the most significant use of the internet by terrorists, whether for radicalization or to raise funds from supporters. And there are already laws in some areas of the world that attempt to ban certain content from the internet. And some countries also advocate an international agreement that would oblige internet providers to identify the owners of websites that they host, and another international agreement that would run alongside it that would ban terrorists from using such websites. But the likelihood of any universal agreement upon these lines is very low in my belief. And the ease with which terrorist groups can set up anywhere where they find it easier to do business means that any agreement that is not universal will have very limited impact. Filtering out objectionable content on the internet is expensive and so far not entirely efficient. And it may be easier to do this with images, for example, in the case of child pornography, than with words. But even in this case, we found that internet service providers were extremely reluctant to take on any policing role. And this was especially true in the case of terrorism, where definitions are so difficult. Internet service providers see themselves as neutral providers of a platform for content, and nothing more than that. But they do, however, we found, react quite significantly to complaints about the content of sites that they host when they receive those complaints from the public. And even if the content of the sites does not actually contravene the acceptable use agreements that their clients sign, nonetheless, they're quite ready sometimes to take them down. And this involvement of civil society is increasingly important in counterterrorism, not just to remove the terrorist content from the web, but also to challenge it in all public forums. And in this context, I think it's worth noting that there's a rather small number of people who are actually prepared to carry out terrorist acts when compared with the overall numbers of people who access terrorist websites or forums on a regular basis. And equally, the number of active posters on terrorist websites is rather small, and their identification and their arrest can have a significant disruptive effect. The success of these sorts of efforts, I think, has encouraged many countries to establish their own monitoring units and to call for stricter know your customer rules for ISPs. And has also encouraged private individuals or groups to penetrate internet communities that support terrorism to identify their members and reveal their plans. And while some have accused these people of being vigilantes, it is an example of the way that the internet by very nature can stimulate contributions to the common good. In fact, the conclusion of our working group was that because it is difficult for government authorities to deal successfully with the dissemination of terrorist material on the internet, there is this increasing role for civil society. Because inevitably the most powerful voices against violence come from within the communities terrorists target. And the international community, I'm sure, should seek further ways to encourage and empower these voices of dissent. Given the complexity of the issue, it's not surprising that countries have tended to develop a rather varied range of potential solutions to the problems posed by terrorist use of the internet. And they have done so according to their own culture and legal systems and according to their own capacities. Most countries do not host terrorist websites within their jurisdiction and have no technical capacity to block them. And this suggests that in most areas of the world, the best cybersecurity solutions with regard to terrorism may be found by working with the internet rather than against it, by employing its capacity for facilitating grassroots organization and for disseminating information, rather than by attempting to suppress it. Many countries that responded to our questionnaire recognized the limitations of their ability to take effective measures against terrorist use of the internet, and most saw the need for close international collaboration and the sharing of best practice as the only way forward. And while by no means all our study of terrorist use of the internet for terrorist purposes is relevant to the immediate issue of cybersecurity or cyber deterrence, the global nature of the internet and of the threat from terrorism may give our conclusions a broader relevance. Cybersecurity is not a purely technical issue, nor is it a purely legal issue, and is certainly not one that can be dealt with without some level of international cooperation. Our working group intends, therefore, to continue to make a closer study of some of the legal solutions that countries and regional organizations have pursued to deal with cyber terrorism, and to assess whether it's possible to identify any areas of agreement for a future universal convention. Terrorist use of the internet continues to concern many countries, and the widespread desire for international cooperation to deal with it, and the recognition that nothing can be done without the willing support of the United States as the country with the greatest capacity and opportunity to take effective action, provides you with enormous influence. If you believe that cyber deterrence cannot be a purely national activity, it is a good time to think what you would like the rest of the international community to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Definitely want to pick up on a number of those points in the discussion here. I'm going to turn it over to David Grannis. David is the staff director, majority staff director for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence. Prior to joining the committee, he was on the House side working Homeland security issues, and prior to that was working with Congresswoman Jane Harman, who was obviously very active on intelligence matters, along with Suzanne, who was there as well. Following David, we've got Neill Sciarrone. Neill had the responsibility in the previous administration for all the cyber security initiatives as well as information sharing. That's a pretty big portfolio, and of course all very easy issues. But Neill handled it exceedingly well. Neill, prior to joining the White House, I first worked with Neill in the critical CHOW, the Critical Infrastructure Assurance Office, which used to be part of the Department of Commerce, which actually had the lead for cybersecurity inside the United States government on the civilian side a number of years ago. So Neill comes to these issues with a lot of experience, but rather than me yapping away, I want to make sure we get to hear from you, and hopefully we will have some time for some dialogue here. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, and I will try to keep this fairly short and leave everything substantive to Neill to take on. Let me say up front, as a congressional staffer, I'm used to being seen but not heard. So bear with me. As a staffer on the Intelligence Committee, we're rarely even seen. So I've got 2 strikes against me. Second introductory point, a little unusual to be from Congress on a panel having to do with solutions. The last time I was involved in this issue, there were a lot of people who were pointing fingers in our general direction. But I think there's some good news story there. I know that my House counterpart was here this morning speaking a little bit, and I think from my perspective, there's a bit of a silver lining in terms of cyber issues in Congress and how solutions might come through. The good news is that, as evidenced by Senator Collins here, Senator Joe Lieberman making a major address on Friday, a number of other leaders in the Senate really focused on cybersecurity much more than they were so even last year, let alone before then. The organizational jurisdictional issues, while they are tricky, there is at the staff and at the member level some very good coordination going on, which if nothing else is keeping us out of each other's way and making sure that people know what's going on. So how will that translate into legislative action? Hopefully it will help. There are, as of now, since the beginning of this Congress, which started in January, about 20 cybersecurity-related bills introduced, plus another 8 that relates more specifically to Social Security numbers, protection, and identity theft. I'll put in a small plug for my boss, Senator Feinstein, who for years has been working on legislation having to do with data breach and mandating reporting when there are large-scale loss of personal data, which of course plays into all of this. Most of the legislation, or at least the legislative debate, has centered around questions of government organization. I'm not going to get into that one way or the other, except to say that whoever is leading the effort, more progress needs to be made sooner rather than later, and it ought not to be waiting around for Congress to pick a favorite and say who the Senate confirmed position, where that will reside. And the White House effort that was begun earlier this year and came up with a very good list of problems and status report needs to be followed more expeditiously with what to do about them. But when those ideas come out, Congress will no doubt be a very fertile ground for discussing them and passing them. I think the opportunity is that cybersecurity-related legislation and solutions are now at the point where counterterrorism ideas and legislation were following September 2001, which is if you can make a plausible case, it can get through Congress. So the onus is on those who are putting forward ideas and for Congress to enact them. The Pentagon, getting into an area where we just heard about, the Pentagon has begun its own restructuring with Cyber Command. The nomination of General Alexander is now, as of a week or 2 ago, pending before the Senate Armed Services Committee for the process that they will go through. Laudable to be putting together efforts, streamlining them. Members on our committee have had some concern that by putting together a cyber command and by putting together what will be a 4-star general at the head of it, you are putting towards the world a sort of military-style cyber organization that immediately goes to offense rather than defense. Raises the question, where is the White House with a cyber coordinator? Will there be a State Department cyber ambassador, either one, or will someone in embassies have more formally assigned cyber responsibilities so that there's a civilian side of this as well? The State Department, through actions of officials and staff, has been taking the lead on this over the past few years, and from my perspective in Congress, we would certainly welcome more effort on that. On the topic of deterrence, we do not regularly demarche other countries or entities within other countries for cyber attacks or intrusions against the United States. And I think that has generally been because it's been seen as not around normal diplomatic activity, and we strongly believe it should be. more standardized efforts along the line of the Council of Europe and otherwise to set international norms, to set standard behavior, and then allow the State Department or others to go and apply pressure when we have intelligence indicating that nations are supporting entities or that entities are operating outside of their government's knowledge is certainly going to be an important point. Let me just tick off a few short points on the solutions side. Number one, public awareness. October was once again the Cybersecurity Awareness Month. The Senate passed a unanimous resolution supporting the ideals of October being the Cyber Awareness Month. But the more that can be done, public awareness, make people understand, just like you put on a seatbelt when you get into a car, you have certain protocols in the cyber arena. That's something that you all know far better than I do. The need for public trust and transparency. The Obama administration has been more forthcoming with some aspects of what is going on in the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative. More should be done, more ought to be done, both to allay public fears that this is not a huge effort to spy on Americans' data, but is subject to very strict controls that are put in place for a reason and how they're going to be implemented and overseen. Convincing in those cases where things have to remain classified, having Congress be a more vocal supporter based on their oversight to the American people that everything that is going on is not a follow-on of the terrorist surveillance program, but rather is something that is meaningful and important. Capacity building. There are efforts across Congress to increase funding, to support better training programs, more government expertise where needed, to allow resources, the provision in the Intelligence Authorization Bill, to allow resources from the intelligence community to be more easily shared with people at the FBI and DHS to help support across the government. Getting into critical infrastructure, as Neill and I were talking about earlier, it's the next phase, but the government needs to be embracing more what can be done to enable the critical infrastructure to support their sectors, whether that means some version of excusing or protecting against liability for efforts that critical infrastructure companies have to put in place, to better information sharing on signatures and the like, that sort of thing. And finally, taking a thorough review of whether there needs to be new laws on the books to make sure that criminalizing activity on cyberspace is covered. There has been a lot of new laws added to the books on the criminal side since 9/11 to make sure that if someone is out there doing something, plotting a terrorist attack, looking to carry it out, it's something that could be prosecuted. It's not clear that kind of review has gone on in the cyber arena, but to the point you were making, maybe some of these things ought to be looked at in a larger framework. And if a terrorist who is known to be plotting or a state-related actor is plotting to do some cyber intrusions, that any way that they can be prevented ought to be taken a look at. So let me wrap up there.
Thank you, David. And Neill?
Okay, I was faced with the challenge of talking about sort of what are the policy areas that still haven't been tackled and where do we still need to go, specifically as it relates to deterrence and then in more general with cyber. So when you sit down to think about that, I think there's enough issues that could keep me busy for the remainder of my life. So I've tried to limit it to only a few things that I think are sort of the next steps that we need to tackle, and were things that even a year ago would have been a step too far. And there's a lot of familiar faces in this room that have been working on these issues, and it's been interesting to see us make slow, incremental progress. And there's some things that are occurring and being discussed today that when we started on this, never thought would have been acceptable and been a reality and been an area where we could go. And so I think we'll slowly get there. One of the first things, though, is a common lexicon. And I know that sounds like something that's very elementary, but you quickly learn when you have 16 agencies all coming to you on cyber that we're not using the same terms when we talk about things. And that's a problem because you spend a lot of your time talking past each other when you're actually talking about the same thing. And I thought it was bad enough in the federal government. It's even worse when you start to get on an international level. leaving the government and going to a British company, it was fascinating to sit in a discussion and realize that we were using the same words and meant two entirely different things. And so I think we need to get to a common lexicon and really a common understanding of what we mean by cybersecurity. What do we mean by information assurance? What do we mean by deterrence? And make sure that we're all talking about the same thing before we start down this path. And as part of that, I think we need to have those discussions beyond the Five Eyes. We're very comfortable sharing information with those folks, the five comfortable countries. But as everyone has talked about, and Richard, you made this point, cyber is international, and we need to get beyond that. We need to learn how to share information on threats to countries that we're not comfortable usually sharing information with. And how do you build a trusted infrastructure to share when you're concerned with them in other realms of security or of international policy? So how do you create that structure? And so I think from looking at the various areas where we still have to go from the diplomacy standpoint, I think that that's really an area where we need to focus. How do we share beyond those that we're comfortable sharing with? Lots of folks have talked about attribution. So I'm not going to go into that too much, except I'm going to challenge you that I think maybe we're approaching this from the wrong standpoint. If we keep talking about who we don't want, maybe we're missing the point that maybe we should talk about who we do want to share with. Maybe a blacklist and the whack-a-mole of trying to kick people off is not the right approach. Maybe we need to start looking at this from another perspective of sort of whitelisting and building trusted communication, and maybe that's the way we need to go about attribution, sort of an opt-in program versus the kicking out. I also think we need to discuss a risk framework, and I know that that's been talked about a little bit this morning, and I don't mean risk from the typical critical infrastructure risk standpoint. What I actually mean is creating a structure in which we can compare the loss and gain for cyber operations. So a consistent structure in which we make these decisions. And I don't mean just sort of the cyber operations as being the sexy term for non-defensive actions, but I mean in security. So there's a trade-off. As you increase the security of your networks, you're decreasing functionality. And how are you making those decisions? And is there a constant framework in which you're making those decisions? And how do you decide what that trade-off is? And what is secure enough based on the functionality that you desire? So I think we need to step back and think about that. As a part of that, we need to really think about what is it that we're trying to protect. And we can't protect everything, and I think that that's the most important thing to keep in mind as we're working through the policy. So how do you determine that what is important enough to protect, and what's enough protection to put around that? We've tried several times to do this across the federal network. So if you look at FISMA, it asks that there be a risk assessment. The most recent NSPD, HSPD, again, asked for risk assessment. I think that that's an area where we've still been lacking. We have not consistently looked across the federal networks, and by that I mean all the federal networks. They're not a distinction of .mil or classified networks from unclassified networks, and really determined how much information is there, and not looking at it as each individual program, but the culmination of programs, and what is the information that we want to protect. And if there is a culmination of information on a network that we think is important to protect, then that should get more protective measures and more focus than other networks. There's some that we're going to inherently share information that don't need the same type of level of protection and measures, and I think we need to look at it at a more strategic approach of where are we going to place our money and our resources in an environment where those things are limited. We've talked a lot about sort of what are the options, right? So specific to deterrence, what can I do? And I think for a physical attack, we've done a good job of this. We have the national planning scenarios, and we've recognized that there's a distinction in how you respond to something that's a WMD attack versus how you respond to a hurricane. And for cyber attacks, we haven't gotten to that same level of granularity. And I truly believe that there needs to be playbooks put in place. So what can I do? What are my options? What's that sort of Chinese menu that I can choose from when I'm, as a policy person, trying to make a decision on how we should respond? And I need to know what they are in advance, since my options are limited by time and space. And as part of that, who is going to execute them? So if we decide to take certain actions, what department and agency am I going to turn to take those actions? And how is that decision going to be made? I think that's something very basic, but is sort of the next step of how we go about addressing deterrence. And I think we also have to keep in mind that this isn't in the same sort of time frames as when we talk about deterrence from a physical standpoint. So you can't see the pre-operational planning as easily. You don't see, the tanks aligning, the facilities being built, sort of the build-up that you would expect to see. So how do you respond quickly? How do you plan quickly when you don't know who's sort of planning the next attack or who's building up a capability? Understanding who's building that arsenal, we have to turn much more towards our intelligence community and in different portions of our intelligence community than we turn to from a physical standpoint. Which brings me to, I think, a topic that a lot of folks have brought up today, which is, when is it espionage? When is it pre-operational planning? And when is it an attack? And when is it a criminal act? And I think those aspects are pretty hard things to define. But I would actually challenge us to the question of, does that matter? And instead, are we using that as an excuse for not figuring out the actions that we're going to take? If it does matter, I would also question who is it that's doing it. I think our reaction from pre-operational planning or an attack from some countries will be very different than our reaction will be for other countries. And so I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all solution or a declaration statement that we plan to make as the U.S. government. I don't think that that's realistic, and I don't think it's practical. So how do we give ourselves those options? And I think that, again takes us back to this notion of playbooks. And how do we determine what we're going to do based on the circumstances in which we're faced? The last couple of points I'll make are much more easier things to accomplish. Classification. So one of the things that I struggle with is the majority of these attacks are perpetrated on private networks. Now, being in the private sector, I understand you know a lot about how the attacks against your own network are being perpetrated. You understand how it's happening. You understand what's occurring. If you're one of the companies that believes and is involved in information sharing, you might share that with the federal government. My frustration is then you turn around and see that same information in an advisory or bulletin that's shared amongst the federal government as classified. So it's reported in the Washington Post by a private sector company, and over here you have the advisory that says how they did it is secret and classified. We have to work to be more rational about how we determine to classify some aspects of cyber attacks. And I think that it's natural to try to do that since it is actually a method, and we're very protective of methods. But when it's methods that are commonly known amongst the private sector, I think we have to relook at how we decide to approach that. I think we also need to be clear about roles and responsibilities. And I think in this area I can turn to my colleague David. One of the things that we have a tendency to do is pass new legislation and either create new entities or create new organizations and give them responsibilities. But we never tell the organizations that were previously doing portions of that work to stop. And so we've seen that with the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act, and we see that also in cybersecurity. You have multiple departments and agencies who say, this is my role. And they bring their pieces of legislation to meetings and argue about it, and they're right. They're absolutely right. They all have their piece of legislation that they can bring to the table and says, this says I'm supposed to do that. The problem with that is that you wind up with multiple departments and agencies who have responsibility, and you can't hold one person accountable. And at times it is important to hold one department or one agency accountable for accomplishing. It prevents the sort of, we thought they were doing it. And believe it or not, you actually have those discussions and meetings at some times. And the last thing I would challenge us to do is to look at some of the existing legislation. You often hear that opening up pieces of legislation are too far or too much, but I would argue they're fundamental to what we're trying to accomplish, and that it's time we take on things like CALEA and look at whether or not they need to be updated. I think many people in this room would agree that they do, that they don't reflect where technology is going. However, policies also need to be flexible enough to keep up with the technology. And so we need to find a way to make sure that our laws are moving forward with technology and allow innovation and are not restrictive, but yet reflect the current environment. So those are just some various ideas and some areas in which I think that we need to focus on for the sort of the next stages of our policy development. And with that, I actually will stop because I think that the questions and answers are actually more interesting and give you more insight than just listening to us drone on.
Neill, thank you. very rich set of items here as well, and I'd be curious, sort of going backwards, your comments first. What would you see the playbooks looking like? And if you can maybe give us a snapshot, because I also think there's a need to, I call it where beep and squeak meets talk and squawk. You've got decision makers who are not always all that versed in technology and policy, and they are in policy. And then you've got policy makers and the flip side, an equation where you've got technologists who can't necessarily package things in a way that a decision maker can actually use and or implement. So I'd be curious if you can maybe give us a little bit of what you see that looking in various scenarios. David, you had mentioned 20 bills on the Hill. We had just heard Senator Collins lay out a set of issues, and I understand obviously Senator Rockefeller and others have pieces of legislation out there as well. And earlier this morning we heard from your HIPSI colleague, Mike Delaney, that he saw the need for a bicameral approach. Where do you see, and I guess it's fair to say since the end of the Cold War, threat forecasting has made astrology look respectable, and I'm not asking you to look into any crystal balls, but where do you see this going? And how can it be constructive in a way that it is initiating action, but in a way where you're not trying to restrict innovation and technology, which far outpaces Washington or legal matters for that matter? And then Richard, looking at the UN, and given your previous role in Her Majesty's government, where do you see the UN perhaps playing a most constructive role here? And in terms of, and I'm not going to ask you to name names, but which countries have stepped up and have been much more open and transparent to cooperative relationships? So if we can kind of go in that order, Neill, since you were last, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Okay. So as far as what I think the playbook should look like, I think that our actual national planning scenarios give us a good approach to how we would want to go about this. I think that there needs to be detailed sort of playbooks done in each area. So DOD's playbook is going to look very different than State Department's, which is also going to look very different than DHS's. They need to come together through an interagency process so that they're melded and we kind of understand the various options at hand that you have as a policy leader to take action.
That would be at the White House, just okay.
That being said, some of the national planning scenario books don't fit in the 6-inch 3-ring binder. And I dare say that if there's actually an emergency, that the Secretary of Homeland Security is not going to pull out these huge binders and start flipping through and looking to address what he can do. And so I think practically that the way to get to that is you do the work of the planning and then you exercise it. And you sort of have your quick checklist of options, policies, et cetera, that are there and ready to go, so you have an understanding of what you can then implement.
So this is comprehensive, based both on perpetrator and technique and or modus operandi.
Yep. I mean,
have different playbooks for.
And we've done this in very complex issues such as how we respond to a WMD, which gets into the same issue of attribution somewhat easier. We've done this, with hurricanes. I would argue there's still much work to be done on the physical side, but why not throw in the complex aspects of various cybersecurity issues as well. We have a tendency to have one that's the cyber exercise, and cyber attacks aren't all going to look the same. Some might be physical, and so I think we need to be more nuanced and more tailored in how we approach this.
Do we advertise that to both allies, friends, because I really liked your white list idea, but also to potential adversaries?
I think we do it today in the physical realm. I don't think it should be any different when we're trying to address our cybersecurity.
David?
Yeah, to your specific questions on a bicameral approach, 5.5 years ago, the 9/11 Commission came out and said that the problem of counterterrorism is such that you require a bicameral committee with lots of authority, or failing that, the fallback of giving authority to appropriate to the authorization committees. And 5.5 years later, a significant amount of progress hasn't been made on either of those. Frankly, I don't see the progress for cybersecurity being all that much greater. It's certainly an attractive idea, going back to the Joint Atomic Energy Commission, but I'm not sure that the political wings will bear it, which is why that other mechanisms are needed and are adapting to do that, which is productive. On your questions of how do you write laws that keep up with technology, that is very difficult. We talk regularly with the good people out of the National Security Agency and ask them, and Department of Justice, and ask them how what they're doing now, or what they're intending to do, complies with existing law, and they point out all the laws, and they're all written from before the internet was created.
By the way, it's its 40th birthday on Friday, the internet.
So some of the effort is you look back and make sure that the laws on the books are accurately reflecting today's reality. Last year when Congress went through a monumental rewrite of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, and made it very clear to keep out of it certain cybersecurity or cyber operational activities, just to avoid having that same exact problem in the future, and to avoid the problem they used to have with wire and radio communications being different. I would respond to something you didn't ask me, which is having a problem with policymakers and technology specialists who have a hard time talking to each other. And I think that you should expect that policymakers are more educated in these areas. Certainly anyone who responds to constituent demands or responds to what industry is doing needs to be a lot more technology savvy than they were 5 years ago. And so that is not a status quo that ought to be accepted.
And that's going to change exponentially when tomorrow's elected officials obviously grew up with the internet. Richard, internationally, where do we?
Well, what the United Nations offers is, of course, a platform on which people can express their ideas and debate some of the problems that are faced internationally. I mean, the internet, as everybody agrees, is quintessentially a global issue. It has to be dealt in some way globally if it's got problems. What the United Nations doesn't do, I think, is offer a good mechanism for governing the internet. You know, we have the Internet Governance Forum, we have the International Telecommunications Union, and so on. We have bodies within the UN that try and elaborate some sort of system whereby the use of telecommunications, internet and so on, can be spread fairly evenly with countries having similar advantages. But some people have expressed the fear that the UN somehow wants to control everything and have it go through the UN, and I don't think that's true or even realistic in any sort of sense. So really, I guess the UN, in short, will offer the main platform for discussing what grounds can there be for some sort of international agreement on use of the internet, or on restricting the use of the internet for any sort of criminal purpose. As I said before, I think it's going to be a very, very long time before any international agreement is reached.
Thank you. We have time for a couple of comments or questions. Actually, one thing on the UN very specifically, there were initiatives and efforts to look at an arms control approach with the United Nations put forward by Russia and in various forms the People's Republic of China. Any insights on that, where that stands, and what your thoughts are?
Well, I think Russia is incredibly keen to move forward on this debate, and they're very much the main engine, I would have thought, among the big nations pushing for some sort of international agreements on the aggressive use of the internet, on the use of the internet in that sort of way that you refer to. China has been rather quieter, and I think China is still very much looking at the sort of freedom of information issues, free flow of information issues. So of course, China has itself been very aggressive in using the internet as a way to collect information, apparently on behalf of the state. Others here would have more insights into that.
Thank question. We have time for one before the break. And Marty, please identify yourself.
I appreciate that.
By way of background, Marty is a steering committee member of HSPI and a former director, when he couldn't say it, of the National Reconnaissance Office.
And a member of our committee's technical advisory group.
And a rock star.
It would have been a good question for Mike Delaney this morning. Where we are is the Senate has passed a bill with unanimous consent. The House is bringing it up next week, every week that you've asked them for the past couple of months. We are looking forward to the opportunity to conference a bill with them. Once they pass, we think it should be able to be done fairly easily and get a bill signed into law. But we have one big hurdle that we need to get past first.
Thank you, and please join me in thanking our panel, as well as Richard. I think, again, raised so many complex issues that hopefully we're getting our arms at least around understanding what they look like methodologically, how we can characterize some of these issues, and even though we're all looking for solutions, I think we can all fairly say there are no silver bullets and some quick solutions, but I think that with those insights we're moving closer. So please join me in thanking Richard, David, and Neill, and